I've been unable to find a good introduction to the concept of intelligent design, so I just came up with this short video to go ahead and cover some of the basic concepts we'll be talking about in class. For the vast majority of human history, people have basically believed that humans were created more or less ab initio by some sort of being or beings well beyond humanity itself. In the case of the Western Judeo-Christian tradition, this would be something like God, Allah, Yahweh, or somebody like that, who created mankind ab initio more or less exactly the way that he is today. This belief was challenged over a variety of years, but sort of came to fruition through Darwin's publication of his book on the origin of species in the mid-1900s, where Darwin's argument was that this is not the case, that in fact the species that we see today, including humanity, are created more or less by large numbers of very small changes from a specific animal over time. So you'll see, for example, at the bottom of this diagram, where you see A, B, C, D, E, you'll see various offsprings of this go out. And then as time goes along, they accumulate small changes and small changes. And then eventually, by the time you get to the top of the diagram, these animals are quite different from each other. So this idea is relatively straightforward and has been taught obviously in biology classes, but has been challenged many times in America, mainly because there's a large number of people who don't like the fact that you're taking God out of the equation and leaving us in a situation where there's just some sort of mechanism that generates random changes and that ends up with humanity. So this has been attempted to be taught in schools in many cases where we have what's called creationism or creation science. And this came to a head in a Supreme Court case called Edwards versus Aguilar in 1987, where in Alabama they attempted to do this and was slapped down by the Supreme Court because they decided that the creation science statute that they'd put in to try to make sure that this was taught in high schools violated what's called the Lemon Rule. And the Lemon Rule in this case basically says that if you create a statute that it has to have a secular legislative purpose, and its principal effect cannot be one that either advances or inhibits religion. And pretty clearly, if you're attempting to teach this, you're obviously going ahead and attempting to teach some form of religion. So for folks who are interested then in trying to make sure that they did have some form of divine intervention in this whole process, they went ahead and started working on an alternative to this called intelligent design. And this is not a new argument, by the way. This was developed by St. Thomas Aquinas back in very, very long time ago as his fifth proofs for God existence. But it became best known by a guy by the name of William Paley in his book Natural Theology, which again was published in the mid-1900s. And basically, he came up with what he called the watchmaker argument, whereas he said if you're walking through a field and you come across a watch, you can look at this watch and it's fairly clear that there's a variety of things here that all have to work together. There's gears, there's these hands, there's a mainspring back in here, and all these things work together to create a single device that would not work if you simply pulled one piece of it away. And the argument that is typically made for this is then you look at something like the eye. The eye is a very complex device. You basically have a lens up front, which focuses light onto a retina in the back, that's this area back here, which collects the light and sends it through an optic nerve to the brain. But there's also things like an iris up in here, which opens and closes based on the amount of light. There are a variety of things attached to the lens here that will go ahead and pull on them, little muscles that will distort the lens here so that you can focus at various distances. And again, if you take any portion of this away, the eye stops working. So the argument was made fairly clearly by Paley and all the rest that this is an example of where God would have had to intervene in things. Maybe you could get away with the idea that there's some changes, like maybe animals get slightly longer legs or darker fur or something like that. But to come up with something like this where there's multiple connected pieces all working together, that's obviously the work of an intelligent designer. The problem with the eye example is that when you look at the eye, it turns out it's actually fairly straightforward and in fact has evolved multiple times in different animals. And we can go ahead and look at a series of stages, all of which are beneficial to the animal and all of which are slightly better than the stage before. You can start off with just a light-sensitive spot, then a light-sensitive spot in a little cup so you can tell where the light's coming from. Light-sensitive spot now with a pinhole where that can actually act as a pinhole camera. You can close it off with a thin transparent film, and that ends up becoming then fluid-filled, and you can go ahead and protect the retina. Eventually, some of that thin film here will form a lens. Then you can have a fixed lens, for example, that wouldn't be able to focus, but would at least be able, or focus at different distances, but could focus at one. And eventually you'd get some little muscles attached to it and things like this. So this could go ahead and develop over time relatively straightforwardly. And in fact, we know it's done that multiple times because there are multiple different types of eyes in the animal kingdom. And the best example for this is that if you look at the human eye is actually designed backwards. That if you look at it, here's the retina on the human eye. It's in the front. The problem with this is that when you look at the way that it's oriented, it's actually oriented backwards. So what ends up happening is all the light collecting cells are on the back side of this. Then you end up running basically the wires for the sensor, if you think about this thing as like the CCD chip in your camera, over the front of the eye. They now have to all, of course, be transparent. And then through a hole in the retina itself called the blind spot. You have a blind spot in both your eyes where you see nothing, and your brain spends quite a bit of time editing that out of your vision so you actually think you can see there, but you in fact cannot. We know for a fact one of the reasons that eyes have developed multiple times is that if you look at mammals all have this design. We have the same type of eyes like, say, a dog or a deer or a mouse or something like that. All of them have the retina reversed. That's not the case in other animals that have it more intelligently designed, like the squid or the octopus, where the retina is on the back side, or on the front side, and the wires are all on the back side, as opposed to the reversed way we have it for ours. So the eye's not a good example. How about something more complex even than that? Well, we can go look at what's called the bacterial flagellum, and this is sort of the key argument that many of the intelligent design proponents make. The flagellum's this long, stringy thing that sort of comes out of the back of a lot of bacteria here. It spins around and propels the bacteria forward. This thing looks like a motor in many ways. It has a rotor down here. It has a stator. It has a couple of bearings to get it through the various layers of the cell wall. It has a drive rod. It then has this hook and a filament. It even has a switch that turns it on and off. And this is really hard to understand how this might have come about, because this really doesn't seem to have any precursors that make any sense. So this is probably the best known argument from the intelligent design proponents to say, hey, there's something here that doesn't work. Even if we can explain the eye, we can't explain this. So you'll be hearing a lot more about bacterial flagellum and things also like the blood clotting cascade, which is similar. So when we're trying to get these sort of ideas into the world of high schools and things like that, there's a group called the Discovery Institute, which is best known for trying to push this. And they're one of the primary people that are going to show up in the Dover court case. The original Discovery Institute logo is in the upper left here, and you'll notice that this is fairly clearly aiming at a religious background. And this is a problem, of course, for people who are attempting to put this into schools, because the Lemon Test explicitly says you're not allowed to use religion in schools. And if you're going to have an institute like with a logo like that, that's very clearly pointing out that this intelligent designer was in fact the Judeo-Christian God, then that's problematic, and you obviously can't do that. So around the time that the Dover court case came in, Discovery Institute went ahead and changed their logo to this much more secular looking one down here. The other one that you'll see is over on the right, we have the textbook that was attempted to be introduced in the Dover school system called Of Pandas and People. This is a major issue with the court case, because they were able to take a look at the book and discover exactly where all the ideas in it came from. But this is the primary intelligent design textbook out there, and is put out there as an alternative to more standard biology texts. So that's a real quick introduction to where this sort of movement came from. It's more or less a long-standing argument that's been around, as I said, since the 1800s, that's been more or less repurposed in a way that sort of hides its religious origins, and then goes ahead and claims that, oh, well, there's an intelligent designer, but we're not going to say who that is. Although everyone in the Discovery Institute, if questioned, will admit that, yes, that's a Judeo-Christian God. So that's a quick introduction to this, and we'll talk about other stuff a little bit more when we get to the Dover court case.